Hey there, I'm Brett. This is my show, and you're watching us live on the internet, assuming that you're watching this today on Thursday, the 23rd. So, in case you've not been here before, this is my YouTube, Twitter, all the things streaming weekly show. We do this on Thursdays at 1 p.m. US Eastern usually, and if I'm lucky enough, I get some really great guests. And we have some great guests from Docker on the show today, but first I want to get to a couple of things. One is we're focused on Compose today. So Docker Compose, the command line tool, the YAML, the formatting, using it in your local machine, using it on Swarm and servers, maybe even using it with Kubernetes if we get into that topic. But basically, it's all about Compose. So get your questions in early. I'm a big fan of Compose. Obviously, my guests are big fans of Compose. I've been using it forever. And so I want to make sure you get your questions in early because we're going to answer them in order as we go throughout the hour of conversation here. Second, let's talk about DockerCon. So DockerCon is coming up here in a little bit over a month. It's on the 28th, starting at 9 in the morning Pacific US time, and it will be a live stream going all day. We're actually going to have 3 different live streams happening, kind of like you would if you were at the real conference, where we're going to have the sort of the official fancy part of it, which is the Cube doing interviews with experts and leaders at Docker and all this stuff. They'll be doing that and commentating all day long, as well as keynotes. Then there's going to be my channel. So we're basically going to have Docker captains all day long, along with some other guests on the show. And it's basically an unscripted hangout for 8 hours of unending jibber jabber. And so you get to hang out with us. Maybe we'll do some hacking on some stuff. Maybe we'll create some things. Maybe we'll help you troubleshoot something you're working on right now. Basically, we're just hanging out in the hallway track all day. And on the third channel is where you're learning all the sessions. So we're going to have back-to-back simultaneous sessions, all streaming at the same time. So it's going to be a lot going on, and you're going to have always something to be watching on multiple, possibly 3 or 4 different channels at the same time. So it's going to be really cool. Basically, what you should be doing is going to dockercon.com and signing up so you can get all the announcements. And then it's a free event. So there's really no reason not to be there. It'll be an all-day event coming soon. So you'll be hearing me talk about that every week from now until then, because I have a hard time sleeping at night because I'm super excited to be a part of this event. And basically, it's replacing this huge physical event that we all have been going to for 7 years now. So I'm excited to see what we can do in virtual. So I hope you come. Second, if you have not been to this show before and don't know, this is a show that I spend a lot of time on. I have a whole team. We work on this every week. So please support us on Patreon. For just the cost of a coffee a month, you can help make sure that this show keeps going. And I always appreciate any of your support. And for those of you that are already patrons and members there with the exclusive benefits, those things are happening every month. And I thank you so much for your continued support, especially now that it's challenging and we're all at home and we probably need some good news. So that stuff is all about good news. And today we're all about good news. So let me bring you to the show guests. So today I'm super excited to introduce 2 engineers from Docker and longtime pals of mine in the Docker community. We've got in the middle there, we've got Justin Cormack, who's a Docker engineer, been at Docker forever, knows all the internals, so ask him all the really hard questions today. And then over here on the end, we've got Nicolas de Loof, who is out of Europe. Actually, both these guys are out of Europe, so they're basically at the end of their workday. I'm in the middle of my workday. And some of you probably are just starting your workday, or maybe if you're in the middle of the night, that's cool too. So thanks for being on the show, guys.
Thank you for inviting us again. It's been a month.
A whole month. And Nicolas, I think is this your first time on the show? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, that's my first time. I used to have my own YouTube channel. You have the poster over there. But I gave up with it. It was really too busy, so happy to be back on YouTube.
Yeah, I couldn't watch your show. Tell us a little bit about your show, because I've actually, I loved your show. I just couldn't watch it. Go ahead, tell us. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
It was fully French spoken, focusing on the French community. So French people are really bad in English, including myself. And so it was easier for us to just communicate in our own way with our own jokes. And and it was also under the radar of the Docker marketing, so it was lots of fun.
Yeah, and I love that you did it in French, because I mean, so much of the original and continued team at Docker is French, and I felt like it was playing to the original, creators in a lot of ways, and it's just that unfortunately the live translation wasn't that great, so I would try to follow along, and I'm like, I think he's talking about Docker, but I'm not exactly sure what he's saying. So you all should just go check him out.
The really funny joke was actually about.
Yeah, and did you ever show up in your chicken suit? Was that a thing?
Oh yeah, so I wasn't able to do it during DockerCon. They know me, so I was a bit more under control. But I did for a few conferences to come with a duck head and crazy things.
Yeah.
Or just breaking. I was shutting down a Raspberry Pi with an electric draw, so it was a lot of fun. I was demonstrating Swarm failover this way.
Well, I always enjoy your humor as when you add it in, and I'm always trying to be funny, so it's nice to see someone else that's actually funny. So thanks for doing what you do. Hopefully, you get some time in the future to get back to that because I like your stuff. Yeah, and Justin is he's everywhere. Justin does talks. I mean, you're not doing a whole lot of talks now, I imagine, in the real world, but
not in the real world. But I mean, the online talks are starting to ramp up. I'm really looking forward to DockerCon. But yeah, I've been invited to a few other talks. People are starting to work out their online talk thing. So hopefully some more over the next few months.
Yeah, can you imagine that it's going to turn into this thing where multiple times a month we're going to conferences, because there's so many conferences lately and we're just getting started. I feel like companies really haven't gotten in their stride yet. So I'm worried that we're going to get online conference saturation and we're going to have too many. Every company's going to have their own virtual conference now, and it's what is it going to turn into? But yeah, DockerCon, and then hopefully KubeCon, if assuming it'll still be virtual in August, that'll be cool too.
Yeah, I think it probably will be, because apparently Amsterdam is not allowing conferences until the end of August or something, at least. Or something.
Oh yeah, at least. Yeah.
So I think that's probably online. But it was funny because with DockerCon, because we planned it before all this started. We're a bit ahead in the planning, I think, and really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think there was a great tweet. Someone said, it seems that Docker was forecasting when they decided to go virtual this year. Yeah. So we're lucky. We're lucky we had a few months of heads up, although we all didn't realize we needed to order all of our equipment. So now the real challenge is there is not a single webcam for sale on the internet right now. And it's hard to get mics and green screens and all the other stuff that we're trying to do. So hopefully we can get all that stuff by the end of May. Otherwise, it'll just be us and our laptops ad hoc, which is, I guess, fine too. But yeah, it's going to be fun either way. All right. So let's get to the topic at hand, because I want to dive in, and we've only got a little bit of time here. We could talk all day, I'm sure, about Compose and the functionality of the spec and the potential for the future. But maybe can you catch us up on the origins of Compose and how, bring us up to speed on where it came from and why it's here and all that? Anyone? I'm sorry, Justin. Yeah.
Nicolas, go on. You were just
so I can talk about my own meet with Compose ecosystem. So when I started looking at Docker in the early version, it was still named Fig. Was a small project, small company that went eventually acquired by Docker. And the goal was really to what we call today orchestrate containers. Was not so pedantic at the time, was just about running a set of containers tied together to offer more than just one container and run them in the right order and manage lifecycle. So that was really interesting. Kubernetes was not just a thing at this time. So there was tons of way to do the same. And clearly Fig was both efficient and really popular because the format was extremely concise and was following the Docker CLI. So you didn't really have to read the docs, just have to do what seems to be the right thing, put in your YAML file, and everything was just running right. So so it was obviously adopted in the Docker ecosystem.
And I think I just always assume that it's what made YAML so popular in the world since then.
I mean, it was one of the first things that I was using. I mean, I think back when I was starting to use it, I don't even think CloudFormation had YAML support. It was still JSON. So you're right. It was a really early YAML popular tool.
Yeah,
So
yeah. By the time I remember, I made a conference with David Gajot at the time at Devox in Belgium, and we were as part of the talk, we were discussing orchestration, and we had a slide with maybe 5 distinct formats to run a set of containers. So obviously Fig was part of them, and probably was one or maybe only 2 of them were using YAML. So everything that was the JSON time. We had the XML time, JSON time, YAML time. What's next?
Yeah, and version 1, I mean, you're right. It's version 1 of the spec, which I don't even think about anymore. It was super simple. Didn't have services, right? Didn't even have the version command in it, and so you could have a 10-line file that was like everything you needed. It was a pretty good day. And then we made networks and we added volumes and all these things, and now we have what we have today.
That's it. I think the very first version was more or less an alternative to creating a bash script to group all your commands. And the interesting aspect of this is that this proved that using a declarative approach made perfect sense to actually manage a set of containers as part of an application. Because clearly, I was part of those who had tons of small shell scripts to avoid having to remember a very long Docker run command with tons of flags. And today, that's still a pattern. Lots of people are using Docker Compose not to run an actual application, but mostly to store a way to run one or a few containers with various options in a very easy way. So they don't really have to know exactly what are the options. They just do a Docker Compose run something, and everything is set up for them.
Yeah, whether it's for you or it's for someone else who might want to use it, because who can just do Docker Compose up and it's done, and you get clone Docker Compose up, something's running. That's great. You don't need to think about how to put it all together and type in command lines and things.
Yeah, because I mean, even for those of us that have been doing these commands for half a decade or more, it's I never want to type another volume command or another mount command, right? I mean, I just don't. And so, having that YAML is just a lifesaver. And then when you start looking at like these teams with microservices, I mean, I just started working on a project where we probably had 300 lines of Docker Compose YAML, and it was not even a complex project. It was just they had enough databases, enough environment variables, enough different parts of the app. It wasn't a microservice. And, when you start adding in all the volumes and, mounting in entry point scripts for automated, database creation, like you start doing all that stuff. And these files are really super handy. And you're right. I still feel like even with all that, it was very readable. It was clear what each section was about. There wasn't too much nesting of stuff, which I sometimes I struggle with on Kubernetes manifests, where the container specs and the pod specs and inside the replica set inside the deployment, like that there's not this so much of inception in the file. So I really appreciate it, and I'm still glad that there's so many of them. How many? Docker said recently how many, like over 500,000 files on GitHub or something like that were Docker Compose.
It's something like that. If you use the GitHub search for Docker Compose YAML, it's somewhere around that. And that's just the public ones, let alone people in private repos
that are using the default name, right? Like it's the public ones that are using the default name, and the YML, not YAML. Yeah, it's a subset for sure.
That's interesting that we can find such on public repo, which means that they are actually used for development environment or contributors. In many cases, that's a way to just bootstrap a development environment, or a way to just run a library or a service for testing. Because as a developer of a concrete application, even assuming it's open source, that's really a very small subset of our users. So much Docker Compose file on GitHub demonstrates that there is tons of use cases, not just running an application. And so that's really interesting to discover them all.
Yeah, I was lucky enough a couple years ago to work on a project. I think it's called the Osmosis Foundation, out of a University of Maryland, where they were trying to do basically it wasn't really machine learning. It was just more high-end processing of pharmaceutical data, and like studies and stuff like that. And they needed to run a pipeline of tools, and they would hire consultants to do all this setup of these clusters of systems that could then take a batch job and run it. And we effectively turned that into a Docker Compose file. So they were telling me, like, they used to hire consultants for $200,000, for one setup of a cluster to run one set of things. And now they just tell people, use this YAML file, write some of your stuff in a shell script that they'd already sort of created, and you can run it on one or many, Compose servers or Swarm servers, and with one file. It was pretty crazy. So it made it a mere mortal. It gave them the ability to run these things without needing a specialized consultant, and that was kind of the power of Compose for them, and it was all free. So, so when we talk about Compose, I want to get one question out of the way real quick. I often tell people don't use it on a server for production. What do you think about that?
I think that's part of the reason we are talking about this Compose specification today. That there is lots of confusion between Docker Compose as a tool and Docker Compose as a YAML format that is supported by Swarm for the Docker deployment on an actual Swarm cluster. So in this context, you can use it for production. It can also be used on Kubernetes. Either if you are using Compose on Kubernetes, which is a Docker product open source, or Compose with a K, is more a conversion tool, but with the same idea in mind, that a Compose model is simpler to write, and that we can do a reasonable translation to Kubernetes APIs. So ECS CLI is also supporting Compose files. So that's this idea that you can't run Compose on production is clearly focusing on Docker Compose as a tool that having as principal use case is to focus on developers. Clearly, it's more a development tool. That being said, I need to admit I have been running some of my own code with Docker Compose that was considered production, but don't tell others, please.
I mean, we know there are a large number of people who run it in production. So, but then, I mean, there's a large number of people who run Docker in production on a single host, just because it's an easy way to run something, and they're not, orchestration isn't the kind of thing they want to get into, and Docker Compose works. And so we definitely know there are a lot of people like that. It might not be, necessarily the best thing to do in the long term as you scale up, but it works. It works fine. For many people. I mean, I think there's lots of ways of getting started with containers, and because there's so many Docker Compose users, I've spent a lot of time the last few months as we've been doing the spec talking to people about Compose and how they're using it, and companies that are helping people with Compose. And there's a lot of people using it in a lot of different ways, and we want to help these people, whatever they're doing, to make it the way they're working with it better.
Yeah. I know I still see it a lot, and use it a lot in CI as well. I mean, I think there was some edge cases I saw on servers with maybe like dynamic environment variables on reboot, not necessarily working, but so I tend to advise people to try Swarm if they can get away with like a single node, if they're just trying to do a single node thing on a server, rather than trying to use Compose. But yeah, I know a lot of people that do it. I mean, I'd say it's not so much lately, but for years I would run into a company and they were, before they learned about orchestration, all their servers were running Compose because they were just they loved the simplicity of it, so they would use that on servers. All right, so are we at a point now where Compose is established, right? It's got tons of files, tons of following. It comes with all versions of Docker installs. Well, if you're using Docker Desktop, where are we now? So like we had this announcement about the spec, and what is that? So can you talk a little bit about like that announcement and then what that even means to the average person? Because I had to read through it to really start to digest what the potential for that and what that really meant.
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to note is that like Compose didn't really have what you call a spec at all. It was just there was Docker Compose. It was written in Python. It was it didn't in itself didn't really recognize that there were any other implementations of Compose, even though there were at the time. And every time we did a new release, we'd add some, we'd add of Docker, eventually add the features into Compose to match that. And it was very tied to specific things that Docker was doing, like Docker Stack and things like that, where we made changes to Compose to fit with the Docker product roadmap. The whole idea of the spec is that we turn that around. We say, right, here's a spec. This is a list of what Compose actually does, which we've taken from the current implementation as it was on the day we released the spec, really. And we said, this is what it is, what Compose is. Anyone can implement this, and we'll try and work out a conformance test to work out, are you implementing it correctly? Because that's always a difficult thing to do. And then we'll say, well, if this was difficult to implement because you wanted to implement it for Kubernetes or something else, ECS and the team there implemented it, and they're like, we can't implement this bit because it's really hard. It doesn't work for us because our network setup is totally different from the Docker network setup. What do we do? So the idea is now you can come along to the spec repo and you can open an issue and say, or a pull request and say, we want to change this. Doesn't work, or this doesn't work for us. How can we fix this so that it works better for us? And that will be the new route going forward. So it won't be tied to the Docker Python implementation strictly, although we're going to implement everything that in the spec changes in that implementation going forward, because that's what a lot of people are using. But other implementations will be equally welcome to come along and be real Compose implementations. We'll have tests, so we can say, yes, these ones implement everything. These ones implement some things, but not some of the optional pieces. At some point, when we actually get around to saying that there are optional and compulsory pieces, and we'll have some things like Compose files you can test your implementation against to make sure that it's implementing features correctly and things like that. We got some skeletons of that now. It's still very early because we didn't really have anything before except a bunch of tests that we used against Compose implementation we had. So we've taken as many of them as possible, put them in the GitHub org so that we can build that out in future and make it something that everyone can work with, that's not tied to Docker versions, not tied to the Docker tooling, and is really a community-driven thing with lots of input from all the other groups of people. I think we found maybe 7 or 8 implementations of Compose, half of which we didn't know about at all, maybe more than that now in the last few weeks. So it was, because Compose is so popular, loads of people have built it into other products, which is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the point that lots of people are already more or less using the Compose format in various ways without having a common way to discuss how it will evolve. So Docker as a company is aware of the popularity of Compose 5 format for a long time. So that's one reason Swarm deployment was driven by Compose. If you remember, there is also an alternative to use a Docker application bundle, I think, as a raw way to deploy to Swarm, but actually the command is Docker stack deploy, expecting a Compose file, because that's just what people want. Same applied to a Docker app as a way to distribute your Compose application. So far, the evolution of the Compose format was mostly driven by ideas coming from Docker company, and we have discovered when open sourcing this spec and getting people from various places to join talk about their own use case, talk about their own implementation that may differ in some ways. That there is many other possible ways to extend Compose, to implement things. So Justin was talking about networking, with obviously so far is really tied to Docker way of managing networks. And having this place for open debates on how the spec can evolve, and at the same time ensuring that we are not breaking the existing ecosystem by just introducing some, let's say, V4 that will focus on many things. That's a very interesting way to just embrace the fact that there is a strong community behind Compose and that this can be driven in the open. We just don't need to put Justin and a few product manager in a room and create a new V4 format.
Right.
Maybe this happens.
Yeah, that's that. Can we go to TOML and then we decide to come back to YAML?
Exactly. That could happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much goodness there. It's like I feel like we have a really great foundation, as a community, for sure.
I mean, there must be bits that you've wanted to change after, you're a big Compose user. There must be bits that have annoyed you, or that you've wanted to say, why is this like this? Can we make it different?
Yeah. Well,
why did
I have
you
some
remove
topics.
extends
I have
from
some
V3? that came out. We had a community meeting just before this, and why was extends taken out of V3 was one of the questions that came up.
Yeah. I think that was really interesting that at the very first community meeting, where mostly it's just to say hi to each other and know where we come from, one of the first question was to understand why something was removed. Because some people use it. So maybe it's not perfect. Maybe it doesn't really match what we had in mind for the evolution of Compose, but it's there, and we have to manage it in a way or the other. So if you look at the Compose spec, you see that we included all the fields of the V3 format. Some of them really are tied to Docker engine running on Linux. So we could have infinite debates on deprecating them, but they are here. We have to handle them. People are writing Compose files with them. So we can just consider they are optional, that a Compose implementation should just warn users that it doesn't know how to address them. That's it. But don't just break the format. That's really the lesson learned here, and that's a way that it can evolve and embrace new use cases.
Yeah, I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole of like version 2 versus version 3, which I'm prepared to have, because I think it's one of the biggest sources of confusion when I'm working with people and students, and whenever I have like a conversation about Compose and when I want to impress somebody with some feature they didn't know about, I'll usually talk about the differences between 2 and 3, because I mean, that number one challenge of like everyone assumes 3 is a complete superset, and that there weren't, deprecated isn't the right word there. Just I think like we forked. I feel like we forked with 2 and 3, right? Like there's things in 2 that aren't in 3, and there's things in 3 that aren't in 2, and we all have different opinions on why that happened, and maybe just a lot of it was due to a lack of time to re-implement those features in 3, maybe. But I definitely see how, like, for me, the future, if we're talking about opening it up, right, is the future meaning that this is going to maybe be like version 3 to me felt very Swarm specific, right? Like a majority of the features were deploy, and all that feature set under deploy was very focused on Swarm, even though there's nothing Swarm in there. Like it doesn't say anything like Swarm as part of the spec, but it felt like it was just adding in the things only because Swarm could add them. And so for a lot of people, they didn't realize that we left a lot of 2 features behind in 3, because those features, like Swarm is not a superset of Docker Run, right? It's a select set of features that make sense in a multi-node environment. So often for people, I give them the cheat sheet of, if you're writing Docker Compose locally, like if you're literally using the CLI tool, use version 2. If you plan on using Swarm, then use version 3. But if you're not going to use Swarm, there's really nothing in version 3 that you want. Like, I mean, like you don't need any of those features.
It's confusing, because if you're not using Swarm and you're just using Docker Engine on desktop or something, and you're not in Swarm mode, it'll just say it can't implement various features in v3 anyway.
Yeah.
So
sure.
it's not even the implementation of v3 for non-swarm is not complete because it doesn't do replicas. So it's actually like some of the features are already set optional depending on implementation. It's just we don't really talk about the fact there's multiple implementations already. But there's actually even Docker has multiple implementations of Compose in effect.
Yeah, and I love that I love your idea of the degradation, notifying of features that aren't effective in the implementation, right? Like Compose does that, Swarm does that, and I've always appreciated those little notices of, hey, I'm not going to use the build stuff because I'm an orchestrator and I don't build images. Like that's super helpful no matter where you are in your learning, because this stuff might change, right? I would love, Kubernetes also has a challenge with this stuff with YAML where, things aren't always obvious whether or not, it'll just tell you when it fails, but it may not tell you when
eventually.
Yeah. Or when your version of the API is no longer functioning, it'll tell you that. But yeah, and so I love, and Docker is already known really for great CLI work and a great UI in the command line, and so I kind of it's one of those things we almost expect it from Compose as just a friendly functionality out of the box like that. So is the Compose spec?
Errors and friendliness is going to be very important going forward in terms of this. I think we'll probably have to have some conformance tests for being friendly.
Yeah. So of this working group, I think there was something talking about in the blog article about the potential for partners and what other things, like something about AWS and Compose. Like, was that a thing?
Well, AWS are already using Compose. It's available in ECS, so it's available from ECS command line, so you can do ECS Compose up and things like that. So they've already got implementation, and Microsoft's on there because Azure also has an implementation as part of Service Fabric, although I think that's very not very well known. I didn't realize they had one until we started talking to them before this as well. So yeah, both Azure and Microsoft, Azure and AWS already have Compose implementations, and they're really keen because they obviously have a lot of the issues that anyone else running Compose on a very different platform has, particularly things like networking. I mean, networking is the thing that is so specific to Docker networking, and we know we have to make it more generic because it's just it's literally lets you run Docker network create with an IP address and a range and things like that, which is just so specific, and it doesn't match the networking model on any other platform, or it doesn't even match the networking model on other places people run Docker where they use different networking. I mean, it's very, very specific, and so they're interested in that. But they're also consumers of the some of the code that we have, the Compose Go library and things like that, as part of their implementation as well.
Yeah, so when we talk about implementation, so there was a question about where do you use Compose apart from Swarm. So we're talking about Docker Compose command line is technically an implementation of the Compose spec, right? Or before it was spec, that's the first one that we all saw, and then we saw Swarm, and then now you've just talked about multiple clouds that do it. Would Compose with a K be considered an implementation since it's converting into manifest?
I mean, you can do Compose up with a K, Compose up. I mean, it'll you don't have to just output the YAML, kube YAML. You can literally use it as up and down. So I think that's very much an implementation, and we want to take part of the code there and use it, as a standard have a standard conversion from Compose to Cube, because there's other use cases that want to implement, or in fact, we know of at least four implementations of Compose for Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And so, making those, sharing code between those obviously makes sense.
Yeah, including your own, right? Like Docker has the Compose on Kubernetes.
We probably have more than one.
Yeah, and I mean, this kind of stuff doesn't happen unless you really struck a chord with the community, and that people are actually wanting to re-implement this YAML. So I think we all could appreciate more concise YAML, and of course with simplicity comes restraints, I think, in a certain way. So obviously, I think when people talk about, what can Compose do, that comparing it to other specs like the manifest specifications for different Kubernetes resources, like it's hard to even have that conversation because they're so wildly different. And when you, like you said, depending on the implementation, right? So depending on the tool there, Compose with a K has been mentioned several times in chat, which is a way to convert Compose files into Kubernetes manifest. Docker has a tool that you can run in the Kubernetes cluster that actually converts it on the fly. But then you start looking into that specification of what Compose features equal to Kubernetes features, and it's effort. No matter what we do as an industry, like there's going to be effort there, right? Because the manifest is purely written for the raw input of Kubernetes, and any other format that would be shorter is going to have some sort of level of compatibility matrix or functional feature set list or something where they don't implement every single feature.
I mean, you don't. I mean, I think one of the things that came up in the community meeting today was we need to define exactly what is and isn't in Compose, so we don't go in the wrong direction with it, because we don't want to extend Compose until it's Kubernetes YAML, because we've already got Kubernetes YAML. That's not the point.
We don't need another one.
I think that one of the things that we've talked about, for example, is whether Compose should just stay as the user's view of their application, and all the concerns about the kind of operational environment should not be in the Compose file, and there should be some process, depending on how you're going to production, that put them in later. So they're specified separately, which is a little bit slightly like the approach we took for Docker app, where you could have some things that was like scaling that was set up. You could set a runtime that was ops. The ops team could adjust the scaling, but the app didn't set scaling, and there's that was just like, I define my app, and then you can scale it in production. But maybe, we talked about some models with this for converting Compose to Helm, for example, was where you could have a plugin that would set additional parameters for Kubernetes that were, that would deal with things like adding sidecars and whatever other kinds of additional other pieces of stuff that that I can run my app locally from Compose and it works, and then I should be able to give that to someone or run that through a program or process that converts it into another form that does the right thing in Kubernetes for my production cluster, but that might be different from your production cluster, and I wouldn't want to replicate that locally when I'm developing, but it shouldn't break anything in my application once it gets to production. So I think that sort of separation of concerns will help, and something along those lines will help us keep the focus on Compose as a developer tool and an application definition tool, not a do everything for everyone tool.
Right. Like I can see if we start putting ingress functionality into Compose YAML, how this, because people, there are scenarios where people have asked me like, hey, everything goes through a proxy in our production. Can we do that locally for like dev and test stuff? And yeah, totally. But it's not going to be all in the YAML. It's going to be, like an Nginx configuration file that you're editing instead of YAML configuration that you're editing or something like that. Right. Unless maybe something like traffic where it actually can take just labels or environment variables as definitions for that stuff. So I feel like that's those areas where like in ingress and networking and stuff like that almost is implementation specific, and then that could be a lot of time labels or environment variables anyway. So that we don't really need all that first class functionality in Compose, and that gets us down the argument of what's in a label and an annotation and what's in the actual spec. So I don't want to go there. So I wanted to show a couple links just because we're talking about this. So we've talked about the Compose spec IO page. So go check that out. That is backed by a GitHub repo. right? So that people can go check out the actual spec, get involved. And also, you also created this awesome Compose repo, which is a ton of examples. And I recommend everybody check that out. I'll put that in chat. So
yeah, that was. I mean, we had some of those examples in other places, but they were really hard to find. It was Anchor put them all together, and it was really great because people really just want example. I mean, I think people want examples of like, how do I use this stack? How do I do this? Like, let's get a simple. Just when you're starting with containers, like, what's a good way of doing it? And then, in particular, having really good examples of how to do things well was hard to find because there were lots of examples around, but they weren't necessarily best practices. So we've had a lot of people opening pull requests to say, you should do this like this. If you're running, React, Spring, MySQL, this is the best way of doing it. And collecting those things in one place is really helpful for people who want to know. Like, so we've kind of divided them up in, as you say, in the contents of like, not production ready, just get it going, or things that are really designed to show you how you might run something in production.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's always tough because there's, even when you just start to get into one framework, there's varying opinions about how, things are supposed to be run. And I've seen, like, for example, I don't think it's Flask. I think it's one of the PHP frameworks that they have their own Docker, basically, it's a Docker Compose generator. And it's so advanced, and it basically obscures the Compose away from the person running it, and so they don't know all these things that are happening in Compose YAML. And I don't know, I'm more of a fan of the opinion that every developer should just learn Compose, trying to hide away Compose, because Compose was designed to hide away the complexity of containers and all of our environment configurations for developing. And so to me, it's the perfect tool for developers to use. And when we see these other tools that try to wrap Docker Compose inside their tool so that you're not using Docker Compose, I don't see a lot of extra functionality. It just avoids the user from having to learn the Compose spec. And as long as we keep the spec simple enough, I mean, at least it can fit in one web page, right? So we forced it all into one web page. And so I have this up all day, every day if I'm working on Docker. I have the Docker builds, the Docker file information on one screen, and I have the Compose spec on another. And I love that they're on one page. I can, search the page for it, everything. I don't have to keep jumping back and forth between different pages. I know it's super long, but I think, didn't you all tell me at one point, like, these are some of the two most popular pages on the docs is the Compose spec and the Docker file spec?
That's maybe a minor distinction we made in the Compose spec, that the build and deploy section have been separated in a dedicated document because they are focusing on very specific use cases, and we made them explicitly optional as part of the spec, because when you are running on just a local environment, deploy section don't really make sense. And when you are deploying on a cluster, in many cases, you don't have specific build service. You just access a Docker registry to pull your images. So that's a simple way for us to make the distinction between them and have the core specification really focusing on how to assemble containers together with network volumes and other resources to build your application.
Yeah, and if we want to get into some like the version 2 and version 3, if people are really curious, I recommend a couple of things for you, because we're not going to have the time to go through all these differences and all that. Well, that's almost like that's a separate conversation for a separate time. But the version 2 and version 3, a lot of that information is on Docker docs. So I would recommend everyone who's using Docker Compose today, it's we're all in a chance right now a lot of people have a chance to learn. They've got a little bit extra time at home, not having to commute. So you can go through all the versions they have put in here and see the changes that are happening in each version, which I think is relevant for staying up to date on all the new functionality. Because if you learned Compose years ago and you haven't checked back recently, whether it's the Compose command line, which is technically different from the spec, like both of those things have been adding new functionality at a pretty steady pace for years now. So you can now go on the website through all the Compose versions and just the main docs page. And then this is the versions list, right? So you can see like version 2 and how that works, and the difference between version 1, 2, and 3. You can see the compatibility matrix stuff. There's a lot there that I recommend if you're working on a team, especially, and you're responsible for these Compose files. You'll find that you can do a lot more in Compose nowadays that you maybe previously had to do with, like entry point scripts or some sort of bash scripting or automation that you don't have to do anymore, because Compose handles it out of the box with the Docker Compose command line. Also, on the Docker Compose page, where you can download new versions of Compose if you're running on Linux, because Docker Desktop does provide those new versions for you. You may not realize that, every month really, or every month or every other month, there's a new version, or at least a new RC version of some Docker Compose version. And for example, I was actually looking earlier, and I'm just going to do a real quick list so that we all are sort of aware of some of these things that are happening. For example, in just the Docker Compose command line, in the last year, we've had build kit support. So that allows you to enable the new Docker build functionality in Compose. We have Docker SSH support, which means you can use Docker Compose command line against a remote Docker server without having to do any certificate work. You can basically, as long as you have SSH to that server, you can use Docker Compose against that server. And then, let's see, what else? We've got 3.8 spec coming soon in Docker Compose. So for those of you that are really interested in the leading spec, I recommend you go and check that out on both the docs page and also in the Compose releases, because you'll notice there's release notes. And the team works really hard on these release notes that I read. And so you can see bug fixes in each version, and you can see the new features in here. For example, upcoming versions of Docker Compose are now going to be able to support Docker Context, which allows you to change your Docker environment from the command line. Whole bunch of stuff there that we would have to have like a 3-hour show to get through. But it's all, the cool thing is it's all in the docs. It's all in the release notes of this stuff on the releases. I guess if we're going to a spec, when we end up with a spec repo, I guess maybe the spec differences would end up in the repo release. Would that be?
We have to work out how we're going to version the spec as well. But yeah, as features go into the spec, they will go into the releases as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So after 126, there'll probably be spec references in the, and also there should be spec references in the release notes going forward after 126 as we make changes.
Very cool. All right, so we've got a bunch of questions. So, for those of you asking questions, hang on, we're going to get to them. But yeah, versioning the spec. So you're saying that maybe the version of the spec is not going to be the same as the version of the Compose file format? Am I understanding that?
There's even a very interesting discussion. So that was a proposal that came very early in the preparation of the spec, and this proposal came from Justin about just getting rid of versions in the Compose file itself and getting the implementation to just being driven by the feature it can support. What we have seen that lots of people are using Docker Compose by just copy pasting from Stack Overflow, and sometimes the sample you get is using version 2 or version 3.2, pretty old ones, and then you won't have access to recent features that your Compose implementation supports. And looking at the Docker Compose format history, if you don't consider the V2 and V3 break, most of the things have been added on top of the previous version. There was no real deprecation or change in the way a specific field was introduced. So today we could, as part of the spec, we could define another way to address the Compose file parsing, to just say accept any field, even if it's from a recent version, as soon as you can handle them for your own implementation. And that would relax the requirement for people to check the versions they are using especially when you are using multiple Docker Compose files, to create a complex stack or to override things. Today, you need to have the exact same version everywhere. So all those constraints could be relaxed. And so that's part of the discussion we have today on the Compose spec. So I can't tell if this will actually happen. But that's a very interesting debate to have with the community to understand the possible impacts, to understand the possible new use cases this could provide, and to see what others think about that. So that's really great that this is not a discussion we just have within Docker, but really with the whole ecosystem around.
Yeah. We got a lot of stuff in chat too about we have questions about versions. So someone's asking, so for testing, is it better to use version 2 in production version 3? So it's about what tool you're using. It's not so much about test or production. It's more like what is the implementation. So Docker Compose, right? We're talking about Docker Compose being an implementation. It for local use tends to have better features in version 2 right now. If you're talking about Docker Swarm, that requires version 3. You can't use a version 2 file with Swarm. So yes, that's kind of the answer to that question. But it's more about where are you using the file. For teams that I'm advising, usually it's just even if you're using Swarm, you might want to even keep two separate sets of files. We don't like the utopia of one single file that works in dev, works in test, and works in prod. Like, we're not trying to do that. Like that was maybe the simplest examples maybe work that way, but I think in the real world, most of us are all going to need multiple compose files. But there is so much you can do there. I could probably sit here. We could talk about how to use the Compose YAML for advanced teams for hours. You can use templating. You can use overrides. If you're using version 2, you can use extends. You can. There's just so much you can use there, and it's all in the docs. Like if you just sit for 2 hours and read all the docs in Docker's docs, they spent so much time there, and so much of it is about how to use Compose. I think there might even be a page on how to use Compose in production. But you just go through the docs. Really, there's the menu on the left will have every single page, and if you're scanning through it and you don't recognize something, read that part because it could pay you big dividends on your daily use of these tools for sure. So we have more.
I need to admit that while working on the spec documents, I discovered a few features of the Docker Compose that I wasn't aware.
Yeah, and I'm sure that even though I've been scouring that stuff for years and trying to teach everyone every single feature of it, I'm sure there's a ton of stuff in there that I haven't used. So someone asked a question, for example, is there tools to check the Docker Compose bin correct syntax? And so I said, yes, Docker Compose config, essentially. And that also will allow you to take multiple Docker Compose files and override them, essentially mash them into one. And then you can even pipe that to other commands. So if you have a regular Docker Compose file and then you have an override that maybe is just your custom settings, where maybe the regular Docker Compose file is for the whole team, and then you have your own custom stuff that you override on top, go search Docker Compose override in the docs, and then you'll find this whole docs information about how to use an override file. And it's just great. Thank you to the docs teams for making us all sound smart, because that's where I'm learning all this stuff. Dry run. There's not really a dry run. Someone's asking like dry run, but that's kind of like the config. I mean, if the config works, but that's more of an implementation question, I guess. Swarm doesn't have really a dry run, and Docker Compose CLI doesn't have a dry run really.
But yeah, it would. Yeah, generally, I guess, because it's especially locally, like. You having a dry run's a bit weird on your laptop, but yeah, for production things, I think some implementations could perhaps benefit from it, or some way to know what it's going to do in advance. If it's a more complicated implementation, I think that's definitely a feature that would be useful for some implementations in future.
Yeah,
I mean, in a sense that Docker, like the Compose, output me a QBYAML as a sort of dry run. You can read the QBYAML and see if you like it.
Yeah, that's mostly the point, that you can validate that from a Compose point of view, your file is correct. Doesn't mean that you actually enabled communication between your front and back end.
Right.
So that dry run will be okay, but if you don't actually run the application and check that everything is working well, it's only a partial validation. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you want to have a Compose test file that actually checks some stuff and makes sure that things can talk and you can actually do that. So you want to, I mean, that's in your test, you want to actually have a client that connects to it and actually does things.
Yeah. And we don't have time for it here, but my secret little, like, I tell people something that their the eyes are open wide, is that if you are locally dealing with wait for it, which is essentially where you need your database to be running and connections accessible before you start your app. First, we always recommend that you create apps that are resilient, so maybe they auto start or they retry. But for local development, that's not always ideal, because you just don't want your app spinning and using a bunch of CPU. So there's a feature in version 2 of the spec, and it's all in the docs. You just got to kind of weed through it and find it, that allows you to use a health check. So you use a standard Docker health check inside your database, and then you can tell your apps to not just depends on, which only really by default will just wait for the container to start, but not be ready. You can actually say wait for it to be healthy from the health check, and that's all in the version 2. So if you go through the version 2 page of the Docker Compose spec, you'll find that stuff in there. It's like if I could leave the audience with anything, I actually made a quick little sample that I'll just show you on the screen of what the file looks like. It's super short. And it's just depends on, and all you can see here is in the database. I made a health check command that's up here. I put in a file that is the health check, which Docker provides examples of these. And then down in my app that depends on the database, you have to add those extra lines, like the condition service healthy, and that's been there for years, but so many people just don't realize it because they learn, like we all do this habit, right? We learned things long ago and then we didn't relearn all the new features. And that, for so many people locally, you'll actually watch Docker Compose up, wait for the database for a minute before it even tries to start their app containers. So that's my tip.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the reasons I really like the idea that we actually merge V2 and V3 and really focus on what the implementation can support, which means that if you are using V3 format on a local Docker engine, there is no reason you can't support this. So the code actually exists in the Python Docker Compose. If you deploy on Kubernetes, it's probably way more complex to support this, and that's the reason it was removed for Swarm support, because by definition you don't have full control in exactly when a container is alive, and it can just die in the middle. So having this control by version is really frustrating. So that's really that's part of the evolution of Compose that I expect can drive very interesting improvements.
Yeah. My chat wasn't working there for a second. Yeah, there's two other quick examples I just wanted to get out there. We talked about the build kit. Build kit is the new builder in Docker. You can use it with Compose if you just have these two environment variables set in your shell. And then the other one here is the SSH ability. So if you want to use Compose or Docker against a remote Docker server that you have SSH access to, you just need to change the Docker host. So in this case, I would just set the environment variable Docker host to SSH and then the user at host, and assuming you have certificate authentication to that SSH. And you can find on my channel on YouTube, you just search like Docker SSH. You'll probably find some videos from me and other people on the show that we kind of show these demos of how this stuff works. Also including build kit. If you just do Docker build kit search on YouTube, you'll also find those examples as well.
You also can connect to SSH server with context support in latest version of Docker Compose. So,
that too, yeah.
Yeah, we should definitely write more about the context in SSH because not enough people know about it. I mean, I think the whole connecting to remote Docker with certificates was really difficult to set up, and the SSH thing is so easy that no one should ever use certificates again.
Yeah, I know. I don't like. I never want to have a public TCP port, on Docker host or it published in any way. In fact, I don't even think I've created one of those. I don't think I've even run the TCP port for years on anything I've ever built. So because of this SSH and other advancements. So yeah, it's thank you to the community because I forget, but I think the SSH feature was added by the open source community. I can't remember.
I think it was Akihiro.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was a very, very awesome addition. And for those of you wondering, the health check thing I mentioned, that also is Docker. Docker has a library that they have all these health check examples that you can add in, and it's mostly for databases. So you want your databases because they're slow to start up and other things depend on the data. So you can add these examples to your Compose file and just kind of bind mount the file, the shell script in at runtime, and you don't even have to make your own custom images. So all that stuff's there for the major open source stuff. I use it all the time in my projects. And so that's a great resource that I also put into chat, although it doesn't seem to be showing up for me for some reason. All right, so let's see if we can nail out a couple of questions, and we've hit the hour, and we're going to have to wrap this up. But I want to make sure we get some more questions in that are relevant. For some of these questions on implementation, like how do I use extend volume with Docker Swarm? Those I'm going to say a lot of that stuff is in the docs, so we're not going to be able to give you examples of doing that today unless someone's got a quick answer. How to use extend volume with Docker Swarm. There was another one here as well. I've lost it now. I lost the question. That was more of a technical implementation question, and we're probably not going to be able to get to it today. Oh yeah, like is there a way to use the image command in Docker Compose to reference a Docker file without using the build and context command? No. I mean, under the build, you have Docker file, so you just build colon then the Docker file, I think, right, isn't it? And then you just specify the Docker file. You can hard code the name in if that's what you're looking for. Question.
And just as a note, we also have on the Docker community Slack, we have a Compose channel. So for people with some precise question or technical question, feel free to just join, and you can get answer for advanced user, or some of the contributors are really watching this channel to answer your questions.
Yeah. Good reminder. Yeah, the Slack community is great. Can we? So this is a great question. This is a great last question. Sorry. So what's the future of Docker Compose? So that is you have won the best question of the afternoon. So so can someone summarize what we think is ahead for the Compose spec and Compose in general?
Well, I mean, so we're both trying to speak at once. Go. Yeah. I think what we just kind of discovered is that everyone loves Compose, and but they do want to use it in different types of environment and to do very different things. Some people just want to use it for development. Some people want to use it for testing. Some people want to use it in production. Some people want to use it on Kubernetes. There's so many different things, and I think that the future is a much more diverse community of people trying to achieve different things, but using the same tool that they all really love and find easy to use. Yeah.
Nicolas, what do you say?
Yeah, I was saying that. So you probably know that we have published a public roadmap hosted on GitHub with all the high-level epics that we're working on, and one of them was rewriting Compose in Go, and it wasn't the top voted one. So it's still it's still a planning phase. We have prototypes on this topic and lots of discussion on the best way to not just create an alternative to the Python code, but really to embrace Compose support in the whole Docker portfolio. So that's really something we need to take care of, and that clearly demonstrates expectation from our public to see Compose both as a format and as a tool to evolve and offer a new feature. So we were talking about the feature introduced in the recent releases, and there is so much we can do.
And almost all the people who are using Compose elsewhere are using it from Go code, so the Python code is harder for them to use from this point of view. So there's been lots of bits of implementation in Go, but having a common set of code that everyone can use for some of these things would be helpful. I mean, there's already the Compose spec already has some bits of Go code for parsing and things, but it's just at the beginning.
Yeah. Sorry for everyone. I'm posting links multiple times. Our chat client across all these different streams is down. Essentially, it looks like their site is down. So hopefully the stream doesn't get cut off. Yeah, in case you didn't know, the roadmap, like Nicolas mentioned, the roadmap. Go if you want features in Compose. This is a great place to put it. So yeah, check that stuff out. It's the place to go to ask what. And that's the thing is, if you want this stuff to have new features, there other than just putting an idea in the regular GitHub issues of every different repo, and which tends to get lost in all the fixing. So it's really great that we now have this place that we can start focusing on the new things rather than the bugs that might be discussed or the PRs that are happening. And this is a much more condensed, focused area. Plus, maybe things we wanted, because a lot of this stuff is now, I mean, we're getting up there in time. Like we're talking about, this Compose at Fig. I mean, Fig is what, 2014, 2015? 2014 probably?
2014, I think, yeah. I used to have a Fig sticker on my last laptop, but I don't think I've got any anymore.
Limited edition. They're not making them. Yeah. Well, with that, I will say that, when it comes to the command line, Docker Compose keeps adding new functionality, the command line. So keep checking on the releases. We got 126 coming out. 125 was just launched this year. It's got some of those several new features that I mentioned earlier. If you're on Docker Desktop, you're getting the new versions whenever they're released. So that problem is solved for you. And obviously, you can download the pip packages, the Python packages on Linux. So I want to thank everyone for all these great questions. We've had tons and tons of people asking questions today, and hopefully we got to all of the big questions. Sorry for anyone who, if they had specific implementation questions, we couldn't get to you. I want to thank you, Justin, Nicolas. By the way, Twitter handles, GitHub handles are all down there in case you want to follow these people, see what they're doing in open source. And thank you so much to you two for being on the show. And now it's happy hour time for you since you're in the EU. And I will hopefully have these guys next, come back on. We may have some other guests talk about Compose later on when we got some new stuff to talk about when it comes to the spec and some new tool implementations. That'll be fun to talk about. But for those of you here, thanks for watching. And we'll be back here next week for another YouTube Live on Thursday on my channel on YouTube. And you'll also see this showing up on a podcast called Docker and DevOps. You can check out that podcast on your podcast app. So thanks. We'll see you next time on the internet. Ciao.
Thanks.
Thank you.